All right, for this video, I'm going to run over pretty much just how to organize a microcycle uh, with certain information on someone's demographic kept in mind, as well as certain scheduling limitations, because someone's schedule throughout the week is going to be a really big determining factor, on which days they can train and how we actually organize the order of stress throughout the week. We can give a pretty general idea of when we want people to train throughout the week with things like their frequency, like I don't know if someone's benching two times, or sorry, squatting two times, benching four, deadlifting two. It'll be pretty easy to organize the order of stress throughout the week just with that information in mind. But it's important to keep life schedule and what days someone actually cannot train in mind because you can organize someone's microcycle with just frequency and just general demographic information like their weight class and their leverages and things like that. But it can get all thrown out of whack once you figure out which days they actually cannot train throughout the week. So I've got 5 examples here on some general microcycles that I'm going to organize based on what days someone cannot train, what their leverages are, their style of deadlift, frequency on each lift, things like that. I got 3 examples. The first 3 examples are just going to be athletes on my roster that I currently coach who are anonymous. I'm just going to, these are just a general demographic of athletes that I already coach. So I'll just kind of like explain the reasoning why their microcycles are laid out the way that they are. And then I have 2 that I asked a couple coaching friends of mine to give me that I'm going to go in completely blinded to. And I'll just actually write those in real time. It might be a little bit awkward for me to do that, but um, I'll be kind of going into these ones a bit more blindsided at the end of the video. So these are going to be they're honestly funny demographics. I think they tried to make it as hard as possible for me, but um, yeah, regardless, that's going to be how I lay things out. So I'll just get right into it. For this first example, we have a 70-kilo female who cannot train on Monday or Friday for reasons outside of training. Those are the 2 best rest days for her, which makes sense in terms of work and life balance. She pulls conventional, squats 2 times a week. She also deadlifts 2 times a week. I forgot to mention that. So squat and deadlift twice a week, pulls conventional. She has a very short range of motion, 4 times a week bench press. She's not very well leveraged for deadlift, and her squat leverages are fair. So if I'm given someone with this demographic, the first thing I usually write out is oftentimes bench. That one is typically the easiest for me to organize throughout the week with someone's rest days and leverages in mind. So what I will do is start with kind of writing an X on people's rest days. So for her, she's going to be resting on Monday and Friday, like I said. If I can get someone's primary bench day on Saturday, I've mentioned this in my other like YouTube and Instagram content. If I can get someone's primary bench on Saturday, I'm going to do that. So with her, since she can do that, and she has the availability to train on Saturday, and she has really good bench leverages that will likely make a higher frequency bench a bit harder to peak into meet day just because she's benching 4 times a week. If we can get that primary session on meet day, which is most likely going to be Saturday, that's going to be a good way to establish some predictability and consistency block to block. So really easy first thing to do is have her benching on Saturday. From there, we have Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Sunday to place her other 3 bench days. So with how I have things organized for her, we're going to ideally have that secondary session spaced evenly away from the primary. Like for example, we can kind of rule out a secondary session consecutively to the primary day, right? So secondary day will not be on Sunday, and then a better spot for that would either be Tuesday or Wednesday. So I'm just going to tentatively place that on Tuesday. Another thing to note is she's probably going to be benching on Sunday just because it's likely that she's not going to be benching Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then Saturday. That's just going to be this awkward 3-day gap on bench, awkward 3-day grouping on bench that we are trying to avoid. So bench will just mark off on Sunday as a bench day, and then from there, it'll be pretty easy to determine where the 4th session goes, which will be Thursday, right? So that'll be her other bench day because we don't want her benching Tuesday, Wednesday, and then taking 2 bench days completely off on a 4 time a week frequency, right? Obviously, there are some people that are totally fine with that and actually will do well with that, but just with the information we're given, this is the general best layout. So we can kind of just give arbitrary names to the sessions just to represent the order of stress. Obviously, the primary, tertiary, secondary, etc. are very, arbitrary and don't really mean a whole lot. I'm just going to be using them in this video to represent the order of stress. So bench was super easy. For squat and deadlift, a general rule of thumb I keep in mind when organizing someone's week of training, depending on their leverages, and I've talked about this in YouTube videos and on Instagram before as well, is I try to get the better leveraged lift towards the tail end of the week, ideally closer to meet day, so we can have an easier time training into a meet and peaking it, and also just for the fact that the better the leverage is, the more likely someone is to need to be primed for that lift and actually do well, kind of absorbing workload and absorbing intensity on prior sessions going into that lift. And for someone who is not so well leveraged for a certain lift, we are going to, in my opinion, this is just how I do things, bring that towards the beginning of the week, as far away from the other lift primary session as we can get. So for this athlete's case, her squat leverages are more favorable than her deadlift leverages, okay? It's not surprising to see a really well-leveraged bencher who's not well-leveraged for deadlift. So what we're going to tentatively do is place that primary squat at the tail end of the week. Now, we have 3 options for where we can place that primary deadlift session. We can place it on Sunday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. I'm talking about deadlift right now, yeah. Sunday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. Ideally, we don't have it on that Thursday because that's going to be 2 days before her primary day, and like I said, we're trying to get it as far away as possible. Ideally, we don't have it on Sunday because then both of her primary squat and deadlift sessions are going to be consecutive, so we can kind of narrow that down to Tuesday or Wednesday. So we'll just keep that in mind. We'll write primary deadlift on both of them for now. Her secondary squat, we can also narrow down to Tuesday or Wednesday because she's not going to be squatting twice a week on Thursday and Saturday. She'll have 4 full rest days with no squatting. Same thing with Sunday. She's not going to be doing both her squat days twice in a row. So it's either Tuesday or Wednesday. So for her, someone who's a bit better leveraged for the lift, I'm going to keep in mind that she may do better with a narrower exposure timing on those lifts because, again, that lift might bias towards needing to be a bit more primed. However, I will say on Tuesday, it would be totally fine to have this secondary squat because the lower someone's frequency is, the less sensitive they can be to exposure timing there. So I'm going to tentatively put that on Wednesday, and then for her secondary deadlift, what we're going to do is we have a few options here. We can place it on Sunday, Thursday, or Saturday, okay? I'm going to rule out Saturday just for the sake of avoiding an SBD day. I'm going to organize this secondary day around where her primary day is as well. So an option here would be Wednesday and Sunday. So we'll tentatively put secondary deadlift on Sunday. That would eliminate the option of that primary deadlift being on Tuesday. This is honestly favorable in my opinion because almost everyone I coach, not everyone, but when I'm trying to write someone's first training block or just training blocks in general, I'm trying to get at least one squat and deadlift day on the same day if we possibly can. Multiple reasons for that. I don't want someone doing a lower body movement every single time they train. And to be honest, I just find that it is a bit better from a pain management perspective. So tentatively, I'm going to place that primary deadlift on Wednesday. And overall, this looks like a pretty solid layout. Again, what we can do is place that primary deadlift on Tuesday, but then we're limited to where that secondary deadlift goes, and that will have to be on Saturday. So for the sake of avoiding an SBD day and also just having a squat and deadlift session be on the same day, I'm going to place that primary on Wednesday and the secondary on Sunday. From there, that is going to be what her general microcycle layout is. For this next example, we have an athlete who cannot train on Sunday or Tuesday. 3 times bench, 2 times squat, 2 times deadlift, and he's a 90 kilo male who has really bad deadlift leverages, but really good squat leverages. So kind of like the long torso, short femur, um, I guess deal with shorter arms, right? So we're gonna knock off, I'm actually just gonna copy this for the sake of the font being the same. We're gonna knock off the rest days of Sunday and, this is the wrong one. Let's see, there we go. Sunday and Tuesday are rest days. We're going to do bench first. That's, again, likely what I'm almost always going to do. If we can get that primary day on Saturday, that is the most ideal scenario. So he can train Saturday, so we're going to do that. 3 times bench. So we have we're somewhat limited to being forced to bench on Monday. So we do have a bench day here, just with where his rest days are oriented. He's not going to be not benching Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday on a 3-time bench frequency. We're not going to be doing all 3 of his bench days in between Wednesday and Saturday, right? So Monday inherently needs to be a bench day. And then from there, it's pretty easy, right? 3rd bench day goes on either Wednesday or Thursday. So we'll tentatively put that on Wednesday. I think actually for him, I have it on Thursday. So we'll tentatively put it on Thursday, and I'll get to why in a second. Because at that point, when you have a lifter who, there's a certain option here where both days could work, then in my opinion, you have to resort to what the lifter's leverages are and what their fatigue patterns are. Reason being is for him, he used to actually be a 4-time bencher, and we are reducing it to 3. So he's kind of adapted to this higher frequency. And in my opinion, someone who is already kind of used to that might bias towards needing to have that primary day be a bit more primed as opposed to recovered. However, I do see a world where this 3rd day can be on Wednesday because he is a heavier weight male with this longer range of motion bench, so he might need the extra day of rest to actually come in a bit more recovered on Saturday. So there are a couple options here. We do have this one where secondary bench can be Wednesday, and then tertiary can be Monday, okay? And this works great, but if I were to have him benching on Thursday instead of Tuesday, I would likely have this day be his tertiary session instead of his secondary. And again, these are just kind of buzzwords at this point, but we're using these terms to represent the order of stress throughout the week. So I'm going to tentatively leave it at this, again, knowing he might need to come in a bit recovered on this day, but somewhat have a bit of a narrower exposure time, and considering he was benching 4 times a week before. So that's how we're going to lay out bench. For squat and deadlift, he is very well leveraged for squat and completely the opposite on deadlift. Just needs to get really bent over, can't really get into this very upright position on deadlift, locks out basically at his hips, right? So for squat, again, similar to what I mentioned before, in an ideal world, we get the better leveraged lift later in the week, if possible. Not always going to work that way, and frankly, this rule that I consider does not apply to everyone. But you're going to tentatively place that on Saturday because that is later in the week. Another good option is like a Friday or a Thursday or something. Oops, that says bench. But we're going to tentatively place that primary session on Saturday. And then we're also going to tentatively place that primary deadlift on Monday, furthest away from the primary squat, knowing that this is probably not going to fatigue his primary deadlift, but his primary deadlift is probably going to really fatigue that primary squat. From there, for his secondary squat, we have 2 options. Actually, we only really have 1 option, but we can, in theory, move this primary squat to Friday, and then he can be squatting on Monday and Friday, but then we have an SBD day on Monday. If we can avoid the SBD days as much as we can, I'm going to be in favor of that. But with it being sandwiched in 2 rest days on Monday, it's pretty likely that this actually can be an SBD day, just knowing the limitations of where we can place each session. But I'm going to keep the primary squat on Saturday just for the sake of that being really easy to peak and it being towards the tail end of the week as we get as many secondary days as possible prior to that session. So to complement that, we're going to keep the secondary day on Wednesday because, again, that's really the only option we have for this session. It's not going to be on Thursday or Friday, and I already explained Monday, if we have that primary on Saturday. And then from here, placing the secondary deadlift is a bit tricky. We can place it on Friday or Thursday. Really, that's going to be the only 2 options. Again, we're trying to keep either a 2 full rest day gap or a 3 full rest day gap. between a 2 time a week frequency, right? So essentially for the most part, squat or deadlift. So we are going to place that on Thursday, and frankly, I'm not really a fan of it being on Thursday because I would ideally like a squat and deadlift day to be on the same day within a 2 time deadlift frequency, like I mentioned in the previous example. However, it just doesn't really make sense. There's not really any glaring issues. Like I have 2 athletes right now that have a 1 day rest between deadlifts. And that's usually going to be a secondary day into a primary or the opposite. But I think one of them actually has the secondary day 2 days prior to the primary. But again, for this athlete, I'm not going to do that. The 2 athletes that I do that for, one just needs to be really primed on deadlift, and two, we're dealing with some like pain work or pain, I guess, resolution work, and trying to avoid having that secondary day be stimulus inducing in general. So it's really easy secondary day, so we actually can get away with the shorter exposure timing. So with this athlete, we're going to have that secondary day be on Thursday and just keep it really easy. I think for him right now, I just have him doing 1 rep of deadlift on this day. So it's really, really easy. Knowing that as a deadlift leverages just don't really favor having a secondary day being pushed. Not to say that that's the only right answer, but that's what we are doing layout-wise off the bat. So again, not really a fan of the fact that he's got every single day of the week he's doing some kind of squatting and deadlifting and lower body stuff, but that is going to be what we're doing. I also forgot to mention he pulls sumo, so we're going to be doing a very, very easy secondary day, and frankly, that's another reason we can kind of get away with this Wednesday to Thursday relationship on squat and deadlift. So this one is a bit different and really tricky, and frankly is suboptimal with how I have her layout written, just based on the days that she can train and cannot train. For her, she has a really busy work schedule. Sometimes, so to explain the rest days, Sunday is kind of her relaxing day, and I try my best to keep that off for her. Saturday is a day that half the time she'll spontaneously get called into work, and then we have to move a session to Friday or Sunday. So I try to keep Saturday off as well. So she has weekends off. And then Wednesday is a day that she typically is at work for a long time, and we're trying to avoid training 3 days in a row for her to just manage her very busy work schedule with training. So that being said, she needs to rest Sunday, Wednesday, and Saturday. So we will knock those off right off the bat. And you can tell, based on everything else I have written, she squats 3 days a week, benches 3 or 4 depending on her schedule, and she has good at deadlift leverages and pulls conventional twice a week. I'll add that here. Okay, so the first thing to know is with someone who squats 3 days a week within this layout, it is impossible, literally impossible, to have all 3 days evenly spread out throughout the week. So the unfortunate thing is we need to have 2 squat days in a row, which is unfortunate. But knowing her, I've been working with her for a fair amount of time, almost 2 years, I think. She very much so needs to be primed across the board. Like, she does well with having stimulus before a day that needs to come in strong. So actually writing this squat layout was fairly easy. Okay, it just is suboptimal. And I'm actually going to go over squat first compared to bench, because she does not bench Saturday. So the 3 days I have her squatting are Tuesday, Monday, and Friday. And her primary session is that Tuesday. I was also tempted to have her primary session on Monday, but I'll get to that just with how I have everything else organized. Her primary squat is going to be Tuesday, and that tertiary squat is probably an easy guess here. Again, just using these terms for the sake of representing order of stress and how intense these sessions are. Knowing she needs to be primed on squat and having stimulus before a day that needs to come in strong, that's going to be the reason for that layout. Then her secondary day is going to be Friday, and it's going to be a pretty hefty secondary day. I have her doing a lot of volume here, reason being we need to kind of bridge the gap because it's sandwiched by 2 rest days on either end. So bench, if she's benching 4 days a week, we do not have much of an option as to where the bench days go. So easy peasy putting bench on every single day. is what we're doing. It's just a matter of how we're organizing them. And we've tried 3-time bench before, but with this layout, again, knowing that she needs to be primed, if we get rid of a bench day anywhere, it's just not going to be great. For example, getting rid of Tuesday bench, we're going to have a 2-day gap and a 2-day gap, and then 2 consecutive days. This Monday bench is probably going to need to have a lot of stuff on it. And knowing she needs to be primed on bench, this Thursday just, it's got to be workload intensive, but not too much that it's actually going to beat her bench up the day after. So again, getting rid of Tuesday is going to be not the best. Monday also not the best. She'll have 3 days in a row of no benching, which we do not want. That's the number one thing we're trying to avoid here. Thursday, again, it would mean that Tuesday would need to be that primary day or something along those lines, even Monday. But again, we're trying to prime to an extent. So again, we've landed on 4 times a week. And the way I've organized that is her primary is on Friday, as close to the tail end of the week as we can get for peaking purposes. Her quaternary day is Thursday. That's just going to be essentially there to, get that primary day feeling strong, but not heavy enough to the point that it's beating it up. I think I only have her doing like a 3 or a 4x1 of tempo bench, and it's really light on this day. But again, she needs to bench on this day, or else this 2-day rest gap is too much. To get the secondary day spaced out evenly, we're going to have that on Tuesday, and then this tertiary day is going to be on Monday. So that's how we laid out bench. And then for deadlift, similar to the rule I try to apply for everyone with the leverages kept in mind on squat and deadlift, she doesn't have very favorable squat leverages, but she's very well leveraged for deadlift. So we're going to have that primary deadlift on Friday, as far away from that primary squat as we can get. And then she's going to have that secondary deadlift on Tuesday. And that is how we organize her layout throughout the week. Now, with her, we try to keep sessions not super long. Again, a big theme with her training is we try to keep training manageable with work. So we have her doing 2 SBD days a week. The rule of thumb to keep in mind is the other 2 days, ideally, we try to keep really easy. And like I said, this Thursday session is just a few reps of bench and then some upper accessory work. Monday is going to be really, really easy. I have her doing, I think, 2 sets of 6 on tempo SSB, and it's like extremely easy. I think sub 60%. And then her tertiary bench, and then I think 2 to 3 accessories. So we're keeping Monday and Thursday very light. So this layout does complement the fact that we're trying to keep those in mind. Here are the 2 examples that I had a couple of friends give me, and they're quite odd, so these should be fun. I'm going to do these kind of on the spot, but I might pause the video and think for a bit just so this video doesn't get super long. So this example, this is a 59 kilo male, so very lightweight male. It's funny because I've actually coached someone who was just about this exact same demographic a couple years ago. But 59 kilo male, amazing squat leverages, really, really bad deadlift leverages. So thinking like a longer torso, really stubby arms, shorter femurs, and then a flat back close grip bench. It's funny because I actually, again, like I said, I used to coach someone exactly like this. So they cannot train on Thursday and Saturday. So that's what we're going to do first. We're going to knock off Thursday and a Saturday. And the first thing that comes to mind with this person is this Friday session is probably going to be pretty intensive. 2 reasons. It's sandwiched by rest days, and it's towards the tail end of the week. So we're going to put primary bench on this day. Oh, I hate the font difference. I'm going to have to do this again. We're going to put primary bench on this day. Okay. And then because of their squat leverages, also knowing here part of this puzzle is that they squat 3 times a week, we're also going to have that primary squat on Friday as well. Now that we've placed the primary squat on Friday, it kind of self-aligns where the other 2 squat days are going to be. So it's going to be on Wednesday and Monday. We can also do Sunday, like Sunday and Wednesday, or Sunday and Tuesday are viable options, but for the sake that I'm doing this on the spot, I am going to have his tertiary squat be on Wednesday and his secondary squat be on Monday. And again, we're doing this for the sake of, we're labeling sessions for the sake of, order of stress and what those sessions might look like from an intensity perspective, right? Secondary can probably go on Wednesday, and that can be probably a bit of a more intense session, knowing that he probably eats up squat volume and workload with his good leverages. But for the sake that there's a 2 rest day gap, before that Monday secondary. We're going to place that that secondary on Monday. Something else we're going to do is probably, and again, I'm doing this completely on the spot, so I might need to pause the video and think, but place that primary deadlift probably on Monday to get it as far away from that primary squat as possible, and have a deadlift and squat day be on the same day. So something else is you can train on Sunday, so we should use Sunday as an opportunity here. So he benches 4 times a week, so he will need to bench on Sunday. And then from there, it's either going to be Monday, Wednesday, or Tuesday, Wednesday in terms of when he benches besides that. So what I'm probably going to do is have him bench on Tuesday, and that will be a secondary day. And then this Wednesday will probably be a coordinary day. I think I actually really like the way that that's laid out, to be honest. And reason being, we want that secondary day ideally pretty evenly spaced out from the primary. So Tuesday, Friday is good. We've got a 3-day rest gap, 3-day gap, and then 2-day gap. But I have the coordinary day, so again, using these as very arbitrary buzzwords, be on Wednesday because he's got a flat back, close grip, but he does bench 4 times a week in this example. So he probably doesn't need to bench the day before his primary, and also probably doesn't need that preceding session to be very intense, just knowing his leverages and the fact that he's just pretty much hero pressing it, and that might induce a fair amount of fatigue. So we're going to keep the session preceding the day that we're trying to come in really strong as a really light day. Secondary, already mentioned that, and then the only other option is to put that tertiary, again, arbitrary terms, on Sunday. And then the only other option we have from here is what to do with his secondary deadlift. And it's pretty easy already looking at things, which would just be to place it on Friday. So again, just as I predicted, this Friday is probably going to be pretty long and stimulus inducing. Also, this should say bench. But yeah, that was actually pretty easy. That's going to be the layout for that. So cannot train Thursday or Saturday. Very lightweight male with great squat leverages, flat back, close grip bench, and crappy deadlift leverages. And that is probably something along the lines that I would organize their training around. Okay, last example, cannot train on Wednesday or Saturday. I'm also just going to go ahead and copy this again because I don't know why I didn't have the font appropriate. Wednesday and Saturday cannot train off the bat. This person is a heavyweight male with really, really good deadlift leverages, bad squat and bench leverages. So first thing that comes to mind is to probably have that primary deadlift on Saturday. And I forgot to mention, they're going to be squatting and deadlifting twice a week and benching 3 times a week. Bench, we have a few options. We can do something like Sunday, Tuesday, Friday. And actually we can't, if I want to bring that primary bench as close to the tail end of the week as possible, again, we'll have that be Friday. That rules out the option of Thursday. So we're not benching Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday. So yeah, Sunday and Tuesday are really the only other options there. So I'll have Sunday, Tuesday, Friday for bench. We can also orient that a different way if session length gets too long. Like for example, we can have the primary day be on Tuesday and just kind of like back end deload this end of week bench day and just get rid of the idea that we need the primary day at the end of the week. Not that we need it, but it's just a trend that I bias towards, right? So we can do like primary on Tuesday and then bring this bench day to Thursday if this Friday ends up getting a bit long. So I'll keep that in mind. For deadlift, we have 2 options for the secondary day if we want to keep the primary day on Friday. And again, not saying we need to, but we either need it on Monday or Tuesday. So I'll tentatively keep deadlift on both those days. And then squat, definitely don't want the primary squat on Thursday. We could be doing a primary SBD on Friday, but I'm going to roughly try to avoid that. Primary squat we'll tentatively put here on Monday. And then that secondary session can go on Friday. We can actually probably put primary squat on Tuesday, then have that deadlift be here on Monday. Reason I just did that is because that he's got great deadlift leverages, which probably won't fatigue squat too much. So instead of having the primary squat Monday and that secondary deadlift Tuesday, knowing that this primary squat might beat up the secondary deadlift, right? So that's why I have the squat Tuesday. So that could work, but the only downside here is we do have a primary SPD day on Friday, which again, I'm not opposed to, and we also have this Thursday to work with. So what we could do is actually just bring this primary bench to Thursday, and that wouldn't be really the end of the world. Everything is still spaced out throughout the week on bench. Another alternative would be to bring both squat and deadlift days on the same day, but for the sake of spacing things out, and that deadlift is before squat, not vice versa. I think that would be fine. We have a squat and deadlift day on the same day. Again, ideally, we have this primary bench be on like a Friday or Saturday, but what we would do for peaking into a meet would be whatever session this is, which I'm assuming would be probably a tertiary day, knowing that there's going to be Friday and Saturday completely off, right? And that Sunday bench is likely going to be a bit heavier and more stimulus inducing, and there's going to be more workload on that day. What we would probably do peaking into the meet is just, assuming they're competing on Saturday, right? Primary bench would be meet day. We just probably do this tertiary bench again on Thursday during meet week. So it wouldn't really be the end of the world, because that would be the same exposure timing going from Tuesday to Thursday, which is his current primary bench exposure timing, from Thursday to Saturday. So that actually works out nicely. Also, I just realized that we're a primary squat twice a week, where Friday would be a secondary squat. The only other downside I'm looking at here is on Friday, he would be doing squats before deadlift, which I'm not opposed to entirely, because again, I would like that ideally once a week, but I would probably like it to be his primary squat. Well, I mean, actually, this would be a bit more favorable, so I'll actually keep it at that. But yeah, that is what I would probably do, and I wrote that in 4.5 minutes. So maybe I would make some changes thinking about this for a bit longer. But yeah, heavyweight male who cannot train Wednesday or Saturday with excellent deadlift leverages, deadlifting and squatting twice a week, benching 3 times a week with poor squat and bench leverages. And that is how I would organize that. So I hope you guys get the general idea of just some overall considerations that need to be made when organizing someone's week of training and what that might look like for different demographics. Because I think 3 things, I guess, that really need to be considered when writing a week of training for someone and organizing that order of stress throughout the week is the days that they cannot train. That's the biggest thing, and that's why in all 5 examples you saw me log off the rest days first thing. The other 2 things are their leverages and their the squat and deadlift interference with one another, which ties into deadlift stance, range of motion on deadlift, and just overall fatigue patterns across the 2 lifts. So overall, when writing someone's week of training, those are the things that I consider. So if you enjoyed this video and found this helpful and felt like you learned something in terms of how my thought process goes with organizing an athlete's week of training, then feel free to let me know, ask questions in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching.